Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, where today's story is proof that the apocalypse seems to be a great excuse for the worst decisions. Meet Lori Vallow, former beauty queen, devoted mom, and someone who really took the phrase, "the end is near," a little too seriously. Lori had a pretty standard hobby, collecting husbands. But things took a sharp left turn when she met Chad Daybell, a guy who looked at the Book of Revelation and thought, what if I made this weirder? Chad fancied himself a prophet, not the fun kind with a crystal ball, but the kind that claimed to have seen the end of the world in a vision. And he also claimed to have been married to Lori in several past lives. Kind of like a Hallmark movie, right? Together, they weren't just preparing for Doomsday, they were also gathering followers, making wild spiritual claims, and turning the people around them into collateral damage. This is a story where missing kids, exhumed bodies, and a lot of unexplained deaths start piling up faster than Lori's divorce papers. And it all happens under the warm glow of a woman who claims she could talk to angels, though not necessarily the ones you'd want to meet. Strap in, because by the time we're done, you'll wonder if the end of the world isn't such a bad option after all. This is 10-Minute Murder. In 1973, Lori Cox was born to Mormon parents in San Bernardino County, California. She got married for the first time at 19 years old, but swiftly divorced her new husband, marrying another man 3 years later. The next marriage resulted in a son who the couple named Colby, but 3 years later, Lori was divorced for the second time. Lori married again in 2001 and had another child, a daughter they named Tylee. This time, during her next divorce, she and her third husband had a vicious custody battle over Colby and Tylee, and Lori claimed that her husband, Ryan, had molested both children. Finally, in 2006, Lori met her fourth husband, Charles Vallow, and they adopted a third child, JJ. This marriage seemed more stable than any of Lori's previous relationships, and in 2015, she and Charles were still together. It was during this time that Lori became increasingly interested in a particular book series, a series called Standing in Holy Places, by an author named Chad Daybell. Chad's novels followed a religious theme, which made sense. Like Lori, he also had a Mormon upbringing and had spent 2 years as a missionary. His first novels were more mainstream, but after a while, he found a real niche with radical Mormons who were interested in reading about the second coming of Jesus Christ. According to Chad, his books weren't actually nonfiction. Instead, he gave credit to near-death experiences, which caused him to be able to, quote, see beyond the veil. He stated that the plot of his books, depicting dystopian post-apocalyptic events, accurately predicted the future. By 2014, Chad claimed to be receiving prophetic visions about how the world would soon end because of war and massive earthquakes. And in his personal life, he became less focused on his wife and his 5 kids, and more focused on preparing himself for the end of days. At the end of 2018, Lori went to an event where she was able to meet her favorite author in person. Both of them being married with children, Lori flirted with Chad, and he reciprocated, telling her that they had definitely been married in past lives. Before long, Chad had created a religious group which he called the Church of the Firstborn, and Lori was one of his loyal followers. In early 2019, Lori disappeared for almost 2 months after telling her husband Charles that she believed he was possessed by a dark spirit named Ned Schneider. That's not funny, but it's kind of funny. Lori also told Charles that she'd kill him if he interfered with her spiritual mission. In response, he filed for divorce and applied for a protective order. But only a month later, he changed his mind and decided that he wanted to give their marriage another shot. When Charles discovered that Lori was cheating on him with Chad, he emailed Chad's wife, Tammy, hoping to expose the affair. However, Tammy never responded. Instead, she blocked Charles and deleted his email. A few days later, Charles went to Lori's house to pick up their adopted son, JJ. Lori's brother, Alex Cox, was there. The two men got into an argument, resulting in Alex fatally shooting Charles. Alex later claimed that Charles had started hitting him with a baseball bat, so he'd pulled out his gun in self-defense. Ultimately, Alex never faced charges for Charles's death. In August 2019, Lori moved herself and her children to Rexburg, Idaho. During this time, her neglect of her youngest son, 7-year-old JJ, began to show. JJ required a service dog for autism, and Lori sold the dog during the move. She would leave him unsupervised for hours at a time, and when others tried to confront her about it, she was dismissive. Meanwhile, 16-year-old Ty Lee was never enrolled in any schools after the move to Idaho. The last time anyone saw Ty Lee was the 8th of September, when she visited Yellowstone National Park with her family. JJ was last seen on the 20th of September, and the following day, he was absent from school. 3 days later, Lori contacted the school and told them that she was going to start homeschooling JJ. Although Ty Lee's half-brother Colby received several Venmo payments and texts from her, she never answered any of his calls. And Colby became worried about his youngest sister's well-being. Several other members of the family also became concerned about the children, but never received a convincing answer about where they were. Throughout 2018, Lori's niece, Melanie, had fallen for her aunt's preachings about the end of the world, and she started trying to prepare for the apocalypse. Her husband, Brandon Bordeaux, wasn't so convinced. In fact, he believed that Lori was a cult leader, and he thought that Ty Lee and JJ's disappearance may be due to foul play. In October 2019, Brandon was driving his car home when someone shot him from inside a Jeep. Luckily, the bullet missed, and Brandon was able to identify the vehicle. It was Ty Lee's car. He believed that the driver was Lori's brother, Alex Cox. That same month, Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell, passed away. According to Chad, his wife had tragically suffered from seizures and issues with her blood pressure, causing her to die in her sleep. But none of this was documented in Tammy's medical records. Chad didn't seem surprised at all by his wife's death. In fact, earlier that year, he'd spoken openly about a prophetic vision that Tammy would soon die. Chad's neighbors noticed his unusual behavior about Tammy's sudden death. Her funeral was so quick and so well organized that they got the impression that it had been thoroughly planned. Chad's friends and relatives reported that, at the funeral, it seemed like Chad wasn't sad, but that he was trying to convince everyone that he was. Less than 24 hours after Tammy's perfectly planned funeral, Chad Daybell took Lori to meet his 5 grieving kids and told his neighbors, quote, "I've met the woman I'm going to marry." He didn't waste any time following through. They got married 2 weeks later. Chad justified his decision by explaining that while he'd been at the cemetery where Tammy had been buried, he had a vision of his dead wife's spirit urging him to move on. In December 2019, Lori's niece Melanie reported that her aunt and Chad had both asked her to lie to the cops and say that she had been taking care of JJ. While police in Idaho and Arizona started searching for the missing boy, they discovered that he wasn't alone. His sister Ty Lee had also vanished. The investigation into Lori and Chad started to heat up, resulting in Tammy's body being exhumed and an autopsy finally being performed. Chad had been lying when he said that his wife died of natural causes. In fact, the autopsy found that she'd been asphyxiated. The authorities made an official announcement. Ty Lee and JJ were missing, and a public plea was issued for anyone who knew information about the case to come forward. Lori and Chad continued their bizarre behavior, not showing any concern for the missing children and making things incredibly difficult for the authorities. The day after the initial announcement, there was a follow-up. Lori, Vallow, and Chad Daybell were named as persons of interest, and the police believed that the disappearances may be connected to Tammy Daybell's death. Before long, Lori and Chad's friends and family were coming forward to the media with stories about the couple's strange religious beliefs. In early 2020, Lori was arrested and charged with 2 felonies and 3 misdemeanors relating to Ty Lee and JJ's disappearance. Chad, meanwhile, traveled back to Idaho. People who talked to him about the missing children noticed that he always referred to Ty Lee using past tense, as if he knew that she was no longer alive. Investigators searched Chad Daybell's property, finding human remains buried in the garden in an area nicknamed the Pet Cemetery, where Chad would bury deceased dogs and cats. As well as the skeletal remains of family pets, 2 human bodies were found, a teenage girl and a young boy. While the search was being carried out, Chad tried to call Lori in prison to give her a warning, and then he attempted to flee the scene, but was caught and arrested for attempting to conceal evidence. Tylee had been burned, and somebody had tried to dismember her, fracturing her bones and removing her hands. Although Tylee's cause of death could not be determined, her brother JJ had been asphyxiated and then carefully wrapped in plastic. After being found guilty of the deaths of her children, Lori gave a public statement saying, quote, "Jesus Christ knows that no one was murdered in this case. Accidental deaths happen. Suicides happen. Fatal effects from medication happen." She also claimed to have spoken to her dead children, informing the court that JJ and Tylee were happy and extremely busy in heaven. That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe. I'm the host, and thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you're a new listener, as always, I encourage you to subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts, follow on social media, and check out 10minutemurder.com for all things related to the podcast. Quick email from someone that wants to remain anonymous. Joe, what do you think are the biggest miscarriages of justice? And that is a big question. You got an hour? Because I could probably talk about this for an hour, but I will give you 2. First of all, there's no P in hamster. Say that word out loud and tell me there's not a P in that word, and then try to spell it. No P. Where's the P? But to be serious, I think the biggest miscarriage of justice is anytime someone is put to death in this country when we don't know 100% without a doubt that they are guilty. There are too many cases, there are too many times where years later you find out, oh, maybe they weren't guilty after all. If there's even a shadow of a doubt and they're on death row, stop it. I mean, you can stop it. You can always restart it again. Do that as many times as it takes, because why would you kill someone that's not guilty? I've said this before, I'm not a proponent of the death penalty. I understand the people that are proponents of it, and I get it. I totally get it. But I personally am not a proponent of the death penalty, so I don't think it should ever happen. However, if you're going to do it, you got to be sure, and not just, by the normal standards of being sure about something. You have to know without a doubt. For example, I've done a story on this case. George Stinney Jr. He was a 14-year-old African-American boy convicted of the murders of 2 white girls in Alcaloo, South Carolina in 1944. The trial lasted a few hours. It was an all-white jury. They deliberated for 10 minutes and sentenced him to death at 14 years old. 70 years after his execution in 2014, his conviction was vacated because he had not received a fair trial, had no credible evidence linking him to the crime, and his defense, there wasn't one. If you don't know about this case, please go back and search the archives to find this story about George Stinney Jr. It's deeply troubling, and I don't think that our justice system has evolved much since that time. So what is the biggest miscarriage of justice I can think of? It's that case. That's the first one that comes to my mind. All right, that's going to do it. That is your episode for today. Thank you for listening to 10-Minute Murder.